basically, what we've got today is, and I do want everybody to, jump into the conversation on Twitter and agree, disagree. I know we can count on Paul for help with this, creating controversy and whatnot. But the premise here is, it seems like the enterprise mobility management and the identity provider worlds are colliding in some interesting ways. And so the question that I want each of our panelists to start answering, and that we're going to answer throughout the session, or at least attempt to answer, is, are these worlds colliding? How are these worlds colliding? Why? Is it a good thing or not? Et cetera. So we'll start. Yeah, we'll start with John, and go through the panel. So introduce yourself, tackle the question, add some questions that you think we should be talking about, and then we'll start the free-for-all and see how far off track we can get.
Okay, John Bradley, Ping Identity. Are these colliding? My answer is no. They have already collided. We have EMM vendors who are now offering SAML servers with their EMM service. We have IDPs like Okta who are now feeling compelled to offer EMM services. It's already happened. The question is who winds up being the roadkill to some extent. I don't know that, does every federation provider actually need to provide its own EMM? Don't know. Ping doesn't provide an EMM yet. We partner with as many of them as we can because we want to provide our customers with the options. Does everybody do both things in the long term? What we do know is that we have many customers saying, I only want to allow federated logins from mobile devices that have EMM. And both sides are trying to answer that question for customers, and we have to figure out how to do it with or without killing each other. I'm actually kind of okay either way. You're next.
So I'm Bill Fisher. I'm one of the security engineers at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. And so from our perspective, we do a lot of outreach and engagement with private industry. So if you're familiar with NIST and all the standards work we do with government, we're a little bit of a different entity focusing on private industry. And we see a ton of use cases where mobility and identity are intersecting. Right now we're doing some research on a use case around for the health IT sector. When a doctor has a mobile device and he goes into one practice and he does what he does there, that practice has policies and they have an identity there and the device is under that management. But then what happens when he goes to the next practice? And you need to manage that identity there, and there's a different set of access policies that hospital is comfortable with. So we're doing some research in that space and looking at that. And then we're also doing research in mobile application single sign-on, right? So we see some particularly interesting use cases with people like FirstNet or the public safety and first responder sector where, they have a shared device problem, right? Mobile devices rule their world these days. They show up on site. They have to provide a specific service, whether it's a law enforcement, whether it's EMS. And they need to be able to quickly get access to sensitive information, law enforcement information. Sometimes it's information protected by things like HIPAA, like PHI. So the need for an identity there is huge, and the need for being able to establish access control policies on those devices is really big for them, and they're struggling to reconcile that right now. The other thing we see is, from a cloud perspective, just sort of the breakdown of the enterprise perimeter, and what do you do when a user is accessing information from the mobile device straight to the cloud, right? You don't have the perimeter anymore, or a gateway anymore, or a good touch point through the enterprise network to actually manage that individual and that device. So one of the things that I've heard constantly, both at conferences like this, but at larger conferences like RSA, is the need for context, additional context around the authentication, additional context around the device. One of the questions that I would ask would be, what are those most risk-relevant data points that give you a good sense of context and allow you to make a really good risk decision? And I'll leave maybe some of the other panelists who are actually putting together technologies with this type of technology to answer that one.
Thanks. Ashish?
Okay, thank you. So my name is Ashish Jain. I lead product management for identity for VMware. So the short answer is yes. I'll rephrase it a little bit that instead of colliding, they are kind of working with each other to make the experience the most secure and the best for the end user. So when we talk to enterprises, the most common use case that we hear is, how can I give a secure access to any application from any device? And any application can be a native app or a web app. It can be internal or external. It can be deployed on-prem or cloud. And any device can potentially be a laptop or a mobile device. It can be iOS or Android. It can be corporate issued or BYOD. It can be managed or unmanaged. And then you take into account the user, which can be employee or contractor or partner or customer. So when you take all of those attributes around the user, around the application, and around the device, and you kind of combine them together to give the most secure and the best experience, identity and mobility kind of have to work together with each other. So it's not a question of, what can I get done just with identity. You need to know the device posture. You need to know who the user is. You need to know what applications he's allowed to have access to. So in many cases, to kind of, John said, they're already colliding. We see tons of use cases. Just in the last 2 days, I had at least 10 customer conversations in this conference where people are looking for mobile single sign-on, or what Andy mentioned, how can I have access from a managed device? So we see a lot of that traction happening. As an industry, we can put them into the IDaaS MQ and the EMM MQ, but as a customer, I want secure access from any device to any application, so it's natural that they have to work together.
Naveed Makhani from Okta, lead product management for our mobility business. I won't kind of reiterate what some of the earlier panelists said. I think we share a lot of the same takeaways and insights there in terms of what's happening in the industry and where our customers are headed. I think what I'd add is that point that Bill articulated around the breakdown of the perimeter, and it's really being driven by the adoption of cloud services and now this new communication channel of the device going directly to the cloud service instead of going to the on-prem gateway or that standard perimeter where you had that control point on your on-premises. And what's interesting about the identity provider is that it is the natural control point in this cloud mobile architecture. You think of a device talking to a cloud service, it's talking directly to the cloud service, and that cloud service is architected to say, identity provider, should I let this user in? And at that point, you have this natural control of the flow to say, let me check the credentials, the second factor challenge, but incorporate other factors of context into that access decision, including the device security state. And that's what's driving that integration between mobility and identity so that you can work together to enable that access, that contextual access decision. So I think that's a key driver of this new cloud mobile architecture is driving these two together. And the second area is around user experience, and I think we're going to talk more about that in later discussions here, but around mobile single sign-on and the app configuration stuff that Andy was talking about in a previous session.
Dave?
So I'm David Goldschlag. I'm CTO of Pulse Secure. I think my job here is to say that it's not IAM and it's not EMM. It's really something else. So first, a little bit of background. Pulse Secure is the spin-out of Juniper's VPN and NAC business about 1.5 years ago. So we have 15,000 VPN customers, 18 million connected endpoints. And at the risk of being accused of seeing everything as a nail when what you have is a hammer, I'll admit that that is my perspective, okay? And what I think is that VPN is critical in this decision, okay? So the problem that everybody here is articulating is you want to know it's the right user coming from the right device from the right app, okay? And it turns out that VPN is the perfect technology to solve that problem. So although I agree that there's a collision between EMM and IAM, I think that without VPN, you can't actually solve the problem that we're all here to talk about. Now, I'll caveat that by saying I'm being more assertive here than I would generally be. Well, that's not exactly true. Anyway, let me give a moment. So the enterprise problem is continuous authorization. And in order to do that, you need to know who the user is, who the app is, and who the device is. And the VPN is in a very good place to be able to do that. So does anybody remember Alex Simmons' demo from yesterday from Microsoft with the OneDrive one? That was really great, okay? And what he showed is you type in your email address, basically, and then all of a sudden OneDrive can connect to Office 365, and Office 365 vetted who the user was and the health of the device, and that it's coming from OneDrive. And what's really important about that is by doing that binding, phishing attacks don't work, because you can't just steal the credential, you need to steal the device, and the bad guys, wherever they are, have a harder time stealing the device than stealing the credential. But what's really interesting is I can do Alex Simmons' demo, okay? And my version of that demo is GA, okay? While Alex's was hot off the press. But more importantly, his only works for Microsoft OneDrive and the other Office 365 apps. And what you really want is you want a solution that works for any application. So I'm not really advocating my solution, I'm just trying to state the constraints without requiring the SaaS vendors, who hears from a SaaS vendor, to build special APIs into their applications or to migrate to new standards, because we all know how long that takes to happen. Okay, so the technology that we have is called Secure Sign-On, and it leverages VPN in a pretty interesting way, only for authorization. So it identifies what device and what user and what app it's coming from, but it doesn't tunnel any data. And that's really interesting because there's no other technology, like Ashish said, that works across all endpoints and for all apps that can actually capture that trio of information. Now let me say one other thing. You talked about direct access, right, from apps to services. And I think that, like Ashish said, there's different ways that apps need to connect to services. So in addition to being able to know what app, what user, what device, you also want to be able to do control. You want data center apps to be able to get to the data center, and there's no really other way other than a tunnel, okay? You want Microsoft Office 365 maybe to go directly to Office 365, but there's a lot of interest in cloud-based web filters to route stuff so you see what data is actually moving. And so it actually turns out that VPN is a useful thing. We have another technology called a contextual tunnel that says you can use the VPN only for authorization, or you can use the VPN as a tunnel to the data center, or you can use it as a tunnel to the cloud filter, or turn the tunnel off and use direct traffic, but only get the power of authorization. So it's really interesting to me how old ubiquitous technologies, okay, from old people, okay, can actually be used in brand new ways, in brand new contexts, without adding any burden to the end user experience or to the latency on the traffic. So
great.
That's my
Thanks,
assertion.
Dave. So, I mean, the first thing that strikes me is I've heard a number of different stories about signals and decision points, and there's very little overlap in terms of who should be the final decision point, but there is a lot of overlap in terms of signals, right? One of the things that comes to mind, and this is what I'd like to get the panel to jump into, is there a natural decision point? Let's zero in on mobility, right? Is there a natural decision point between the EMM or the IdP or any other player? Or is that part of the problem today and everybody's trying to use the signals they've got to force a decision, but there are too many choices of decision point to have a clean, consistent answer for a customer?
I think that you may have left out one option that a lot of people have risk engines and run risk analytics, et cetera, across these things. So it isn't necessarily the authorization server, it isn't necessarily the EMM, it isn't necessarily the resource server itself, but there has to be something that's doing your risk analytics across all of this. And I think that we all have hammers that make our nails look slightly different. I would even, I'm going to say something controversial, which is probably going to surprise a lot of people. I would even argue that you can do a lot of this without an EMM if you have applications that are well behaved. So some of the things that we're working on in OAuth, because I have the OAuth hammer. What a surprise if you have a VPN, everything looks like it can be solved by a VPN. And certainly each of the things is uniquely situated to do particular things that other ones can't, so they probably ultimately all have to be used together. But if we actually step back and look at it from this problem from the OAuth and ID Connect point of view. If you have a well-behaved app that's using the browser that can take advantage of operating system attestations, if I can have my app send an operating system attestation to the token endpoint on a connection that can't be blocked by somebody just blocking the IP address of the EMM server, which hypothetically could happen. I'm not saying that EMMs are lacking in any way, but there are different ways that one might go after these things. What you can't block is the application's connection to the resource and the token endpoint. Otherwise, the just app won't work, which is kind of what you want. So if the app themselves can take, and again, this doesn't work for legacy apps that have already been deployed. So going forward, if we can get app developers to use the app auth model, if we can get operating systems like Android that can provide attestations, and the apps themselves can say, yes, I am this app that's been signed by this developer, the operating system says so, oh look, and I do have a pin lock enabled on this device. You don't need to reprompt me every time. If you can get that to the authorization server and then use something like, dynamic distributed session management to communicate your signals back, you could potentially build something that might look a lot like an EMM, but actually was from the ground up starting to manage the apps. Now that doesn't help you with the existing apps where you have to look at Kerberos authentication or VPNs to bring on the existing stuff. But I don't know that we want to necessarily limit ourselves to the existing apps. Okay.
Yeah, I think we got to hear from the EMM vendor at this point.
No, I was going to say, we have
now
to
that I've
take the
provoked
mic
him.
away from John first. I got the mic. So I think I have a mic, it's fine. Just keep it down, don't hurt me. So, there, I know. Before I get there, the point I wanted to make, what I think Dave was saying, the demo that we saw yesterday in the Microsoft Alex, where how you can do SSO from OneDrive into the application, and the way the OneDrive interact with the authenticator using a proprietary API. So whatever solution we come up with as an industry, especially this community, whether it is based on VPN, whether it's based on OAuth, it has to be standard. It has to be based on either the OS API or the protocols that we bring together. Because otherwise, it's going to be a one solution which will make some traction, and then we will again be in the same panel having the same discussion. So mobile single sign-on has been talked at this conference over the last 3 years, and I believe we now have solutions. The work that we have done with the app auth work, the work, all the OAuth extensions, the work around app config, we are to a point where we can solve those use cases by standard protocols and OS level APIs. So I feel like before we get into the solution should be extension and why we wouldn't need EMM, or why VPN is the only answer, we need to make sure that across every device, across the major applications deployed today, and I like the SVC and Chrome custom tabs, but as of today, there is very limited number of applications. So we need to be able to solve what we have today and going forward. So I feel like OAuth takes a lot of progress, but there is some information that you need to get from a device posture, whether it is through EMM or it is through the OS profiles. We need to be able to get them to feed into the control plane in the cloud, which, to your point, Andy, it can be a combination of the identity provider and the mobility server. We always talk about PDPs and PEPs. The enforcement point have to be at the place where the user is trying to access, and the control point is going to be a combination of the mobile server and the identity server.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh in before we?
So I would just add that I think it's less talking about systems and more about systems of record, okay? So an EMM is a great system of record for devices and device health, and directories like Active Directory are for people and users and groups. And I think that might turn the problem thinking about it in kind of a different way. And then there's other systems that start to bind together that information to make authorization decisions in different ways.
Great. I'm noticing that we're already getting close, so I want to make sure we get some audience questions in here, and if there's anyone that wants to, push a button or two on this panel, let's. Not yet. Okay. You seem very.
I haven't yet. Well, I always have something to say. So, but I also want to point out that we do have slightly different perspectives from from some people, which kind of sometimes go unstated, that a lot of, depending upon which your hammer is, conflating the device with the user happens more or less. So Bill's FirstNet use case, we have a lot of cases where you actually have multi-user devices. So, we need to also make sure that in our whatever architecture we come up with, we have the ability to support multi-user devices when the policeman or the first responder changes shift, when the salesperson at Burberry changes, et cetera, that yes, you still have a strong authentication with the device, but the authentication of the device isn't the authentication of the person, and we need to retain the ability to collect both of those pieces of information.
Yeah, that's a great point. For many years now, we've kind of had this implicit assumption of, a mobile device is a device that's strongly bound to a single human. And there are more than one models. There's the, yes, I'm bound to a single human, but there's also the, I'm bound to no one at no time. I'm a kiosk, or what we would call COSU, corporate-owned single use. And then there's the case of, hey, I'm got this temporal binding to someone while I'm on a shift or I'm in a class or whatnot. And the identity rules and what we do there is going to change in each case. Anyone want to dive deeper into that?
I was going to say it's actually more than just a user and a device. It's user, device, and application. So all of these three are entities which should be taken into account before we design what's the right experience. Because an application may actually have no offline data. It may actually be completely insensitive, or an application which requires no DLP protection. In that case, maybe you don't need any protection on the device. If the application is an internal finance HR application, you want to make sure that the data cannot leak to any other device or any other user. So again, this goes back to the three primary entities, and you feed them into building the right experience, which is most secure and the best for that app, for that user, for that device.
So that piece on experience, I think we focused a lot on the enabling access to cloud applications securely. We didn't talk too much about the end user experience, but there are key use cases you can enable by bringing identity and mobility together. I'll give you one example. This is something that was close to my heart when I was at IBM. It was really annoying that IT organization would help users. Every time you reset your password, you have multiple devices, and you reset your password. If you don't get to your devices and change that email profile with the new password, it's hammering the server, it's locking you out, and that drives help desk calls, this user frustration. You bring identity and mobility together, the identity side of the house is aware of that password reset. It talks to the mobility side of the house and says, you own the profiles on this device. Why don't you go update the email profile, the VPN profile, the Wi-Fi profile, so the end user doesn't have to. So it improves the user experience, the IT help desk loves you, and you get a win. And so those kinds of scenarios are emerging now in this cloud mobile world, where you bring those together, you make the user's life easier.
That brings up a really good point. Why in 2016 are we still using the old Exchange ActiveSync protocol, which basically requires the client to cache a password? This is insane, and yet it's still the most common use case out there. How? Why?
So old things die hard, but regardless. I'd like to follow up on what you said. I think there's another transition that's happening from an end user and from an authentication perspective of what's considered strong auth today, right? And what's considered two-factor auth. And I think part of the problem is our customers are trying to fold new use cases into old paradigms, okay? And it would behoove us, okay, to come up with suggestions that, if you're using a dedicated device or if you're using a shared device, right, then the authentication approach may be different in both of those, the strong auth approach. And it will fit back in, I'll point to our friend from NIST, right, because a lot of this is driven by sort of government standards at some level, right? How do you fit these air gap two-factor models into ones where this is the device from which I'm connecting once it's been associated with you? And I think that there's a lot of confusion, a lot of place to show use cases and models, and then strong assertions that it's actually good answers.
Great. We're going to give one last chance for anyone in the audience that has a burning question for our panel.
It would be good to ask if anybody in the audience see the same pattern, have a requirement for mobile single sign-on or any other DLP around the device. We got two hands. Go ahead.
Hopefully more.
Yeah.
Or to keep.
Our problem statement was, and we were kind of looking at solution, and we came up with the same kind of problem. We want to provide access from any device, anywhere. And besides what you mentioned, an additional attribute is a user privilege status. So one of the products that we look at is Microsoft itself, right? Because Office 365 comes with an Intune that actually combines the device management and identity management in one. But unfortunately, it cannot be extended to the rest of cloud applications. So kind of,
I have a lot to say on that.
we're on the same page.
I have things to say too.
Yeah, I was going to say,
So-
I'll John start.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, I spent yesterday afternoon with Vittorio discussing this very issue and how AppAuth may relate to Windows 10, et cetera, and the various models of applications on Windows 10, which, you know, makes my head spin. New model versus old model versus pure Windows NT model, et cetera. I think there is an acknowledgement and some work that's probably going to be done around what they have. The plugin model that they have works really well for their own applications, and how they work with third-party IDPs, it may be something that we can work with them on with AppAuth to, there's a couple of different ideas for being able to do something fairly similar to what we've done on iOS and Android with Windows 10. So that's work that will continue to go forward, and hopefully that will also align with Intune and the various other wonderful MDM solutions or EMM solutions that other people will provide on Windows 10.
I was going to say, without going into the Intune MAM, I would love to see if we take AppAuth and we extend that to essentially provide some other mobility things like AppConfig, and make that the standard SDK, not like a Microsoft Intune MAM, but essentially for everybody, every ISV and every EMM and every IDP. I think that's the way we're going to scale, and rather than, you know, let's have my proprietary SDK. We did that in the past 5 years ago, did not work out, which is why I feel like longer term, we need to kind of come together on that approach.
Yeah, it's worth, let me ask the panelists, those that actually have commercial products, you know, how many of you are in the process of implementing AppAuth flows for your own products?
We see Google, Eric.
So I know there are probably 5 or 6 EMMs that are in the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Both the major IDPs,
Yep.
right? And you know that's an important. That was part of the goal of AppAuth, was to get rid of this. I need 50 SDKs to deal with all the different scenarios of EMMs and IDPs and
Yeah,
and
I think that's key in the cloud world, where enabling choice and the ability to pick best of breed solutions is the type of scenario we want to enable. And so this kind of standards-based approach is not vendor specific, but it's more of a generic approach, it's more of a neutral approach. So each organization can choose which applications they want to support, as opposed to being kind of locked in based on what that particular management vendor supports.
Somebody else had a question in the back.
This will be our last question, by the way.
You keep going.
All the way.
Hey, John, keep going.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Maybe it's not a question, actually. Just want to record my voice because you got all the panels out here. This is one of our crux problem, the experience from a mobile side, like having a one true single sign-on on the mobile space, right? I mean, since you panels are here, like, you know, I want to bring it up, like, the EMM side and the IDM side has to come together to have a standard protocols to enable this experience across in the mobile side. Because if you, I mean, almost in all presentations, I've seen that the graph says that usability and the security was being balanced, but not in this case. The usability is not that great from the mobile side. The user has to, you know, keep logging each and every app to get access to it. Well, that's not a good user experience. Maybe this is the time, like, probably you guys have to get together and then have a good true single sign-on the mobile side.
The solution is that everyone should do what I say in AppAuth. I don't see the problem.
Anyone else want to jump in on this before we wrap?
So we have a question about the non-HTTP kind of traffic, such as POP3 and IMAP, access to email.
For non-HTTP traffic, we have the GSS API OAuth extensions. Again, I happen to have the OAuth hammer, so everything looks like an OAuth problem, but Google has implemented it, Microsoft has implemented a version of it, Apple has a non-standard version of it. We need to, in order to be able to eliminate passwords, we need to be able to actually move people from caching passwords and passing them in IMAP to actually moving to GSS API kitten interfaces for passing OAuth tokens into those applications so we can use the same multi-factor authentication. So at Ping, I can use my Ping multi-factor authentication to allow an iOS device to get to my Google Mail without having any password cached on the device. And I think Google has set a good example. They may have extorted a few operating system vendors to support it, but good on you. Everybody else needs to follow the same authoritarian views that I have.
I guess at this point, let's cut the panel loose and let's thank the panel. Appreciate all your viewpoints.